Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and tonight we're going to be talking about how to write better code. But before I get to our guest, let me welcome in my co-host. Hey, Phil, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Super excited tonight.
Yes, me too. And so let's welcome our guest, our host tonight. Hey, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm good.
What's new?
Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure to have you. And so a little foreshadowing. What are we going to be talking about tonight?
I'm going to talk about the squishy bits of PowerShell. Anyone can learn the squishy bits. Yeah, anyone can learn the mechanics and syntax. That's actually the easy part in learning PowerShell. But it's trying to understand what should I write, what should I not write, how should I be using PowerShell. Once you can answer those questions, then you can figure out, okay, I need this syntax and this technique, this commandlet. I can go look up and figure out how to do that. But they're the little squishy interstitial bits in PowerShell that really are kind of have interested me a lot lately, and that's what I have kind of been focusing on, and that's some things I want to talk about tonight.
You know, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong. I have quite a number of Jeff's books, and I don't remember any chapters on the squishy bits.
No, this is all new content. This is new squishies.
All right. Well,
all right.
I guess we can maybe just start by turning it over to you. A little programming note for the viewers at home. This is a user group presentation you're watching. We meet twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of the month. And so we just want you to understand that Jeff is going to do a demonstration on various PowerShell concepts, but we have an audience of about 65 people with us in the chat, and we encourage those people to actively ask questions. And because they're going to ask questions, Jeff may end up in a different spot than where he planned. And so don't think of this as a sort of a classroom style thing. We're just going to go with wherever the discussion takes us. And we'd love for you to join us at the next one. If you're interested in joining us in person, you can visit us at rtpsug.com, or you can find us on the Meetup application and look for RTPsug. And with that, I think we'll hand it over to Jeff, and it's all yours.
All right. So let me share my VS Code window. Let's see if I can do that. Window, VS Code. All right, so if all has gone well, you can all see my VS Code window.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is that font size good enough for everyone?
I believe so. Yes.
Looks good. All right. I am not watching the chat, so if people have questions, just interrupt me and ask the question. And then, of course, I'll answer questions at the end. I will, at some point, post everything that I'm using tonight up on GitHub, and I'll give Mike and Phil the link, and they can add it to the YouTube notes or wherever you want to add it. Okay. So don't feel that you have to hurry up and try to take notes. Just watch. If you are still really new to PowerShell, and if I'm showing you something that you've never seen before, yeah, you can ask a question, but just kind of let it wash over you. A lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is just demonstrating an idea. I'm not necessarily demonstrating production-worthy code or ways that you would do something, okay? So this is a little bit different.
Hey, Jeff, I was just thinking, I know you have on the screen on line 3 your link, how to find you, but maybe you want to take a minute and just introduce the newsletter that you publish so people can think about maybe following you there.
Well, yeah, if you go to the GitHub IO link, that is my one-stop connection for everything about me. That's where you find all my social media links, some recent presentations that I've done, anything that you want to know about me. That's where you can go. As Mike suggested, I do have a newsletter that I publish. There is a free version and then a paid premium version. There's a link for that. Also, if you go to that github.io page, the newsletter really started a couple years ago with this idea of exploring more about what I call, again, the squishy bits. That's why I changed the newsletter name, but about what is going on behind the pipeline that we don't know about. Things that we need to think about how to write PowerShell code. This PowerShell code that you run or write doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to, there's a human context and a human element to it. And I've seen, because I've been teaching and writing about PowerShell for so god-awful long, I have seen where there are instances where people kind of forget that there's humans involved. They have to type and run this code or interact with it. And so I want to try to focus not as much on mechanics, although I still will obviously do that, but try to help people figure out what should I write, why should I write it? As I have here up in my commentary, anyone can learn syntax and mechanics. I've spent a big chunk of my career writing books and doing Pluralsight courses to teach you all of those things. But we need to look at or think about the squishy, the human bits, kind of the non-technical stuff, so we can decide what is the technical stuff that I need to write. So I have a couple of essential rules then that we'll start with. And some of these should be a review for many of you. The PowerShell paradigm is using objects in the pipeline. We don't parse text. We're always thinking, what is the object I'm going to get or work with? How am I going to manipulate it? And what type of object, if any, am I going to write out to the pipeline? And then how is that going to be consumed? So we are not, for those of you, again, who are new to PowerShell, might be watching, we're not thinking about, okay, how do I get the text to be the way that I want it to be on the screen? That's not what we're doing. So part of that goes to my second point here. Don't manipulate the text. Don't try to write code that manipulates the output to get your desired result. Think about, how do I work with the object that's in the pipeline so I can get the result that I want? Let PowerShell do the work for you. I've seen a lot of people, and these are just what I'm going through now, are really just kind of like introductory topics. We're going into some of these in a little more detail in a moment here. Let PowerShell do the work for you. I've seen a lot of people who kind of like over-engineer their code, whereas if they would just learn a few basic concepts and a few basic commands, PowerShell will do the thing for them. It'll handle the formatting, for example. You don't have to do the work. Let PowerShell do that for you. Take advantage of the pipeline, for example. Think about where your code will be run. Now, this comes down to actually a couple things here. First of all, is your code, whatever you're writing, whether it be a function or a script or a module, is it going to be run interactively? Will it be run interactively, but maybe on a remote computer? Maybe it's going to run on 100 remote computers. So maybe it's going to run via a scheduled task or under a background job. Depending upon where that code is running might dictate how you write that code, because there are certain limitations, for example, with remoting and local variables and remote variables, for example, that you have to take into account. Kind of related to that is, where will your output be created? So if I'm running a command, is the command maybe running on a remote machine in a remoting session and the output coming back to my machine? Or is the output on the remote machine and somehow then I'm going to get it to somewhere else? Is the output going to a text file or to a database? What format does that need to take? Once you kind of think about those things, your decisions on where that code is going to be, what the output's going to look like, where it's going to live, again, those things will drive what your final code is going to look like. You got to think about those things. So those are kind of some introductory goals or guidelines, let's say, to think about, that when I write my code, it's more than just okay, I need a command that's going to do X, Y, and Z. And you start looking for code and research and Stack Overflow and asking GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot is great for giving you the mechanics, but it can't always answer these questions that I'm kind of posing and I'm thinking about, especially when I talk about the little human squishy bits, because AI doesn't know about that part. It can help you fill in the blanks, but you have to know what questions to ask. All right, so first thing, and some of these examples have come about from people who have asked me questions or things that I have seen online or I have encountered. So I'm not necessarily making stuff up. This is stuff I've actually seen in the real world. So this first one here is kind of like that here. Let me scroll down here. This is a function that is kind of a variation on something that I saw conceptually that someone else was doing and they were having problems. And I said, well, you're going about it the wrong way. You're thinking the wrong way. And I'm just going to run the function here first, and then we'll talk about it here. So let me load that function. Let's clear my screen here. Let me hide that. Oh, let's try to type with my microphone in my way or my keyboard. There we go. Okay. So if I run this function getWidget by itself, everything looks perfectly fine, right? I got my object, I got properties and all that. But if I rerun that command and measure that to say, hey, how many objects am I getting in the pipeline? I'm actually getting 3 objects, not 1. And that's because in the function, the person who I got this problem from, they wanted to have some spacing around their output. And so they were basically forcing PowerShell to add additional blank lines. So when I get an output of 3, I'm actually getting a blank line, my output, and another blank line. They're making their problems worse by trying to force PowerShell to format it the way that they wanted it to be by adding extra lines. The better approach, don't do that, obviously, is let PowerShell handle the output. So here's the same function, but without those extra lines. So I'm creating my custom object. I don't even need write output. I find that to be actually distracting to people. We don't use write host because we want to write to the success pipeline. Just create your object or run your commands and let PowerShell write it to the pipeline. So now let's run this line, this function. Now, if I run this, now I get just 1 object, which I've saved to the variable $A. If I really needed an extra line or other formatting around this output, fine. Then I can create a custom formatting file. I can give this object a specific type name, create a custom format file, and then format the output. Let PowerShell handle that for me. That is a separate process than defining the formatting in the function. So,
hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Quick question. On the first one, what happens if you run the get widget and pipe that into get member?
Okay, that's a good question. We'll probably get 2 objects because one will be a string.
Sorry to make you type.
And one, yeah, I can't type and talk at the same time.
Me either.
Yeah, so I get 2. So there's my custom object, and then the string, the blank line. So this would also screw you up if I was submitting multiple objects and then tried to sort or group on a property name. It's really going to be all screwed up.
So the way I handle that, just tidbit is one of the things is when you do get member, you're actually getting 2 objects into string and 1 object into the PS custom object, even though the order is different because PowerShell sorts all that out. The way I would handle that is, heaven forbid, I would use write host to write the first one because that doesn't go into your success stream. And so then I would use the spaces around that.
Yeah.
I know it's awful. I know.
Yeah, that's awful. Don't do that. Don't do that. You should try to avoid using write host in your functions. And I would certainly never want to use write host to insert a blank line, because then that's going to be, yeah, just don't do that. You're just going to cause more problems down the road.
I said it was awful.
Yes, yeah, I agree. It is.
So Jeff, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. But I think the challenge for most people is they don't know how to get around not using write host to add some space.
Well, don't add space. Don't add space. You don't add space here. You would write an object. If you want space, then you learn how to create custom formatting files and put your spacing in there. Formatting the output is separate from the code that generates the output. You should never, I have an example. Well, here, let's just, we'll jump down later here.
Well,
this, because no, here, we'll do something similar, because this is related to the same idea. The output of your function is the output. Okay. Don't try to format it in the function. Formatting is a separate operation that you can control through other means in PowerShell. So here, let's look at this function here. This kind of goes to a related point.
I think some of the messaging is that, as you just said, is you output and understand you're outputting objects. The format of those objects is handled later on, and you handle it separate. Correct. But what you should be outputting is objects themselves, and understanding that's what you're outputting. And the format of the object is irrelevant at your point, of your stage. It's just a separate function. It's a separate thing you handle later on, or you let the system handle it for you, but knowing that it's an object itself, and that's what you're sending out to the pipeline.
Right. So this is basically formatting the output. And we don't want to do that inside the function. Just have the function write the object of the pipeline.
Well, so I'm only asking about this to play devil's advocate. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you. But from working with coworkers at various places, I see the thinking of what they do. And so the thought process that they follow is I write a function, and my use case is A. This is what I'm using it for. And so I want to make it look pretty. And so I add in the right hosts and do some line spacing and stuff like that. And that's great. But I think, Jeff, what you're really trying to say is build tools, and those tools can scale. And so what ends up happening is when you put the right hosts in there and to put all these formatting objects in there, is when you build this tool and it works great on your machine, that's great, and you get used to using it. And now someone wants to say, that would be great if we can get that from 30 machines, and you run it and it pulls back the data, and now it's a hot mess because you didn't plan for it to work that way. And I think that's kind of the hidden message that you're trying to get to, Jeff, which is to build the tool, and then when it scales, because you built it the right way, it's always going to work. Not build it for today, quick and dirty, and then 3 weeks later, when you need to do more advanced stuff, you realize you've built a function that doesn't scale to what you want to do. I mean, that's essentially the key point there, right?
Right. So here, let's go back to the original version here. That bad version has the formatting built into the function. If all I ever wanted to do was just run this command and see the output with the formatting, sure, use write host and be happy. But if I know that I'm the only person that's ever going to use this command, and I know that that's the limitation, fine, go with that. However, maybe next week I realize, oh, you know what? I want to run that command. It's going to give me a bunch of objects, and I want to create a formatted table in an HTML report that has the data from this function. This output is really going to make that, well, I suppose if I use right host, yeah, but I get
think that was
around that, but
I think that was a great example in that fashion there, Jeff, is that at this point, your function is now outputting text. And so now, hey, now I want to send this to a CSV file. Well, you can't do that because you've already formatted the data, so you can't inject that, because what you're now putting into your CSV is now something else other than the object you're looking for, right?
Right. And you have no way. One thing that you have to think about is, especially if you're writing code for other people, is, well, even if you're writing code for yourself, because you have no way of knowing tomorrow, next week, or next year how you might need to use that code differently than when you first wrote the code. So that's why we do things like have parameter validation, for example, because you have no way of knowing if someone's using your function where they're getting a value to feed into a parameter. You can't assume that everyone's going to write perfect functions. They're going to run the command and feed in perfect parameter data with no errors and no mistakes. You don't know if they're setting a variable from some other command that's the wrong type or null or something, and then trying to feed that parameter value into your function. So you kind of have to code for that, because you have no way of knowing. I think I've told this story before regarding parameter validation. I used to work for a Microsoft Gold partner, and we had two teams. There's a dev team, and I was on the systems, the ops team. And we had a developer customer, who his way to test the code was, it was typically like web apps or something. He'd say, hey, what you got new for me? And they'd bring up the application. The first thing he would do, he would smash his hand all over the keyboard. And if the code crashed, it wasn't ready, and they'd go back and fix it. So they learned, to obviously work around his keyboard smash. Because you have no idea when you're writing functions who's going to use it and what they might do. So you kind of have to, unless you like getting phone calls from people saying, hey, your function doesn't work, and you write crappy PowerShell, you want to be able to, I have a point here later, I'll mention it now, don't force the user to do your job. Don't make the user jump through hoops in order to use your code. You need to do the work to make it easier for the person running your code, so that they can be as frictionless and as easy to use and effortless as possibly can be. You want your code to work in the pipeline, work in the PowerShell paradigm. So running a object to the pipeline and formatting it separately and having the most flexibility, that's what you want to do. So actually, I will come down here, because this kind of goes to what I'm talking about here. I think I've had this conversation with Mike on maybe a year or so ago on some stuff he was doing. Write rich objects to the pipeline if your function has to write an object. So here is a function. Again, we're not going to worry too much about the details. It basically queries Aaron website to get some whois information on an IP address. So if I run just kind of a basic version of this function and say resolve whois, so my output is really simple. I have properties for the IP address, the name, and the registered organization. It works. It kind of meets the bare minimum. I have an object being written to the pipeline, but I always want to be thinking, what else could I add? Make it as rich as possible, because again, you don't know. Yeah, I have an IP address and I want to know, who is the registrar for this IP address, but maybe I want to know more information. Now, it turns out that there is a little more information you can get from the REST API. And so here's a version that also adds a little ping, because I say, you know what? Not only do I want the IP address, but I kind of want to know, what's the latency to that IP address? I can pull out the city. I can pull out the organizational handle. I can get the net blocks. I can get the online. I can get there's my ping latency, and I can add a property here for updated. So my custom object now becomes much richer and much more flexible. So let me do this version here. So now there's the output, and I save the variable to $who. Let me pipe that to get member. So there's my very, I think, much more useful object. Now, it may be that looking at that going, you know what? For most people, they don't need to see all of that information. So I can format that. I don't want to do that inside the function. Don't limit yourself in the function itself as to what output you're going to write to the pipeline. Write it all. The bits are free, so just write it all and let formatting sort it out later. The best way to do that is with custom formatting files, which are not that difficult to make or understand. If you install my PS Script Tools module, there is a commandlet called new PS format XML. You can read the help and all that. You basically pipe a single instance of the object, and it will create, and you can specify a bunch of properties if you want a table or a list, and it will create the XML file for you. So here is the XML file. And I have tweaked this already some to add some additional style and formatting. I've put in a little script block, which you'll see here in a moment. But 90% of this, the commandlet or the function generated, so I didn't have to try to manually create the XML. I think James Brundage has a version of this idea as well. So once I have that file created, then I can just do update format data. And now I'll take my object. Now this only works creating custom formatting files if your object has a defined type. So I define that as PS who is. It's not a PS custom object. But now look at my type. So I limited the data that I wanted. It's formatted grouping. So I've got the name. I've actually used PS style to put in a hyperlink to it, and it's underlined and it's in a different color and italicized, so I can add more value to it. But this is all done outside of the function. If you're building a module, you would just include in terms of the mechanics, you would just include this in your module file, and the manifest, there's the formats to process, and you just specify the path to that. And then people can run your function, and it is rich if I need to see everything. So $who right now, because I have that module loaded. So I do resolve. Let's see this to who again. And if I want to see everything, I can just do who format list, or I could create a specific list view. You can create alternate views. So the richer your data is, you can then create additional formatted views. You could create type extensions. You could create property sets. There's lots of things that you can do, but it doesn't make any sense if your object is only 3 properties. So again, you want to think about who's going to run my code and what are their expectations. How might they want to use this information? So by having my default view, I'm making it really easy if they want to go to the actual website. All they got to do is just click on the link and it opens up in the browser and they're right there looking at that data.
Jeff, question.
Yes.
Where in the code does it define the hyperlink for that type?
That is in my formatting file.
Okay.
And I am doing it here. I'm creating a script block for the registered organization label. And in the script block, and this only works in, this is defined to work in PowerShell 7 because I'm using, I'm using the format hyperlink. And these are properties of the object.
That is super cool.
So it's in the formatting file, not in the function.
And that shows up in PowerShell 7. Does that work in Terminal and VS Code? Does it work in the shell?
Yeah, well, I'm in VS Code, and it'll work in Terminal. Yeah. Yeah, you could do the similar thing. Well, formatting the hyper.
You do that in the console? Sorry.
Well, this is only going to work. This will not work in Windows PowerShell because Windows PowerShell, even with Sean's PS Style module, can't do this, as far as I know.
But then you need to load that PS type so that you can format it, right?
Right. You would need to load. You need to have code that runs this update format data.
That's what. Okay, that's the piece I missed. Sorry. Okay, the update
So
format data of that type so that you can have it for later on. I got it.
That's correct. And in a module, you would just, there's a section in the module manifest where you just specify the formatting files and they get loaded.
Process.
Was there a question from far away? It sounded like.
It's the formats to process property in the manifest.
Right. So I do this kind of stuff all the time. So I want to have the richest object as I can. And I have started doing more with PS Style. I did, for those of you who listen to the PowerShell podcast, I had that challenge earlier this year about doing the GitHub issues and reporting on that. If you look at the code that I posted on my GitHub gist, I use a formatting file that also uses PS Style that adds additional, because I think the color adds a whole nother layer of information beyond just the raw numbers. If you see, right, because if you see something in green, your mind processes differently if you see something in red. Right. That's why we've got different colors for errors and warnings and all of that. But you can add that same information, but you would do it, formatting is separate from the output of your command. What you don't want to do is this. This is very bad. I even put in emojis here. And I do see people with code like this. So if I go and run that, and I even gave it a different name here. It looks like it works. But not really. Because it's formatting data.
Jeff, if I could ask, if you could just go back to your function where you said, don't do this is bad. I think you went through that quick. I don't think a lot of people picked up what the bad
so I'm
part
going to
was.
So the reason, and that's what I'm just getting ready to do. So see here and this is a good troubleshooting technique. If you don't get the results that you are expecting when you run code, pipe your command to get member. If you have a really long pipeline expression, back off the last piece, pipe to get member, or keep going back, because objects can change in the pipeline. So I can see I'm not getting my custom object that I expected with these properties. Instead, I'm getting format data. And I'm getting that because in the end block here, I'm taking my object, which is my collection of output, sorting it. That's kind of still okay. But this is the bad part. And then I'm piping it to a format table. So the only thing I can ever do with this function is look at it or send it to outfile or outprinter. That's it. I have coded myself into a corner by adding formatting into the function. So you never want to do this.
And so this, I just wanted to chime in. This sort of highlights what you just talked about 8 minutes ago, which is you can build a function and you can code in the output and it works. But then when you need to scale up, you need to go back and redo the entire, maybe not the entire function, but you have to recode your solution because when the scope of the work changed, the function doesn't fit the work anymore. And so I'm just pointing that out because I know there's people I talk to that be like, I do it and I do it just for me. But I think more often than not, all of us, if you had a chance to query the people who are here, especially the people who have been doing this for a long time, will say, I never realized that code was going to be used for as long as I expected it to. So the solutions you build have longer lifetimes than what you probably envisioned when you first make it. And so I think what Jeff is really trying to point out here is like you think it works for today, but then when you go down the road, you realize you've made a bunch of extra work for yourself because you have to redo your code. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think I've because I have a little comment here, because you don't know how someone or even you later might want to use that output. And this is a definite no-no. If you include formatting in your code, all you can ever get is formatted output. And that will not live in the PowerShell pipeline. So don't do that. You want instead to use a version like this where I have a very rich object with a defined unique type name with as many properties as you think you need. If I wanted to, I had some ideas. I could create some custom type extensions. I could even add custom methods. And you don't even have to bother with building classes or anything. Yes, I could define all of this in a class, but that's kind of overkill for my purpose. This can all live perfectly self-contained in this function. I use this format of PS custom object and just define a hash table just like this.
Jeff, how does PowerShell know what methods to pick up when you make a PS type name? I would assume that when it says string, it knows the methods that are for a string and for certain objects. How does it know what methods to tie to your custom PS types?
Here, let me see if I can show you that off the top of my head. So let's go back here. So $who. All right. So I'm going to add a member. So it's $. Let's see, update. Type data. I'm doing this all off the top of my head here, so. And this is online. All right, so I just added, and I'm going to make a note here. All right, so there is my script method open. Now this, I'm just going to test this here. It won't show because I haven't shared. I'm only sharing my VS Code. But this should, if I did it right, yeah. So that opened up the window for the basically this online link there. So you can use update type member and add, if I wanted to, I could also add aliases. Put this in here. See, so there I added use the alias. So that's how easy it is. There are ways, I have some tools that you can use to actually put all this in an XML file, and then you could add that to the manifest. I typically just put in my module file, my PSM1 file, if I'm extending the object type, I just use a bunch of update type data commands. Is that what you're asking, Mike?
Yeah, I just was thinking to myself that using get member and it brings back the object type, and then I usually see all the methods associated with that. And obviously, I figure there's some backend code that says for string types, use these methods for PS objects, maybe do these things. I was just curious what happens when you make your own type. How does PowerShell know what methods to say are available?
Well, the only methods that are available are these, which PowerShell adds to everything.
Okay.
So when we create a custom object like I'm doing, or like I'm doing, there are no methods. It's all
Gotcha.
properties. You can see everything is technically a note property, but that's really irrelevant. It's still a property. But you can create aliases and methods and script properties. So there are other things that you could do with update type data, again, assuming that you have a defined type name. So that comes down to, for example, things like aliases. Thinking about who might use my code and how might they want to reference the data. So let's say that this was the other way around. Let's say that the property name that I get back, or that I decided to add to my object, was locale. But I don't want to force the user to have to know, oh, locale really means city. Just create an alias for city. And so they can think city. And you can create in your custom formatting file. I come back here, even though I'm using the same property names and for everything, I could change the names. You know, if I wanted to say, instead of saying start address, I could just say start or start add. And it would still then use the start address property. You see it all the time, things like get processed, right? Those column headings have nothing to do with the underlying, well, sorry, they don't mean that they don't mean that they are the property names of the process object. They're the formatting displays for the column headings. And that's really all we're doing here. So make your output as rich and as user-friendly as you can possibly make it. Don't limit yourself by doing the least amount of work. Don't be your teenage child that just does enough to get by. All right, let me go back up here. All right, so we talked about object output essentials. Now, this is more something I talk about a lot here. This comes back to this idea, remember PowerShell is object in the pipeline. We're not dealing with strings. A little pet peeve of mine is when I see people trying to compare Booleans but treating them as strings. So if I have a variable $X and it has a value of true, I will see, and maybe you've seen people write code like that as well, $X equals $true. There is no reason to do that. That is redundant. Because in an if statement, the logic is if whatever code inside the curly braces returns or evaluates to true, then run the code in this script block. Well, if $X is already true, comparing it to true again is just redundant. And when I see stuff like this, that is my clue that the person writing this is still thinking text. They're still thinking I need to do a textual type comparison instead of recognizing that this is an object, a Boolean object that has a value of true, which will force this to be true. So this would be the better approach, right? Because X is already true. I already know that. Because this will trip people up because it doesn't work necessarily the way that you think that it does when you start trying to do these string comparisons. So if I get my current PowerShell process, and we can see that it is responding, it's true, and this property is a Boolean. So a PowerShell newcomer might think, hey, I want to have code that if the responding process is equal to true, I'm going to write the string OK. And think, oh, awesome, that works. However, if they were smart, they would also test the inverse, and that's also OK. See, it doesn't work the way that you want it to work because you're trying to compare strings. Don't be thinking strings. Recognize when something is an object, especially a Boolean, because $P.responding is already true or false. You don't have to do any comparison. So if it's true, okay. If I want the inverse, just use the not operator. So it's, or here, I guess I could do else. But now, because true is false, now the else statement runs. One place so that you can get kind of caught up, or it can get a little tricky, is with stuff like XML, possibly JSON, anything that's already a string. So I have here, I guess I can bring it up real quickly to show you. So I have a small XML snippet, and it has an isResponding property that has a string there of true. If I get this XML data, let's clear screen here, and I look at that, right? So I think, oh, okay, it's true. So same type of problem here. In this case, this is not really testing whether, here I can try this.
So is it fair, Jeff, to think of, when I think of like those comparisons, and especially in the if way, I think of almost the reverse, is that anything other than null, zero, or false is false. Everything else is true. That's kind of how I think of that comparison, or that output, is in when you're doing that F.
Yeah.
Because it'll evaluate if anything other than not false or false, zero, or null will give you a return of, it'll do the work. Is that
right? Here is, I got a variation on this where isResponding is set to false. So in this version, because you have to be careful about seeing objects where they don't exist. It's because this has tripped me up. I see something and I'm in a hurry and I'm thinking, oh, that's a Boolean, which actually in this case, a string.
Yeah, and that's where I point out a valid string of any string evaluates to true.
Right. Even though if I look at this, see it says a string, it's not a Boolean.
But then an empty string evaluates to null.
Yeah. So you have to be careful about what you're doing. But yeah, this code here I see a lot where people are trying to compare a Boolean to true or false. And that just my number one pet peeve that just grates on me, and I know I'm just going to destroy my liver one day if I see a lot more of that. But that goes back to thinking objects, not text. That's really what this whole issue boils down to.
Jeff, do you see much in the way of those negatives? So like instead of checking to see if something is true, you check to see if something is false or null?
Yeah, I try, when I write if statements, I try to always check for true. I guess I have occasionally used, the dash not to turn things around. It's tricky, and sometimes you have no choice depending on the data or objects that you're working with. But sometimes you just got to write it out on a piece of paper, so you can get your head around it. Especially when you start going down double negative rabbit holes, and I think the more that you can keep it straight, say is true, is false, or sorry, is true or not true, the easier and cleaner your code will be.
That's a really good point. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think back to my point there, Stephen, is that I like to think of it is the false section of that question is typically in a smaller subset. So it's easier to think that if something is false, explicitly false, is explicitly empty, it's explicitly, null, or even zero. Okay, if it's any one of those, well, then it's false. Anything else it's typically true in some of those comparison operations. And so that's kind of the methodology I use. It kind of, hey, I can explicitly find these smaller ones that I can wrap in my head. Other than everything else is there's a much bigger plethora of what can be true than what can be false.
And you should, when you write your code, you need to test it with an example that this should be true, and then also test with an example that should be false, and make sure that your logic acts accordingly. And then, of course, do all that again in your pester tests. But don't assume that, oh yeah, this works and I'm all done. You have to test for both sides of the equation. You got to test for positive and negative. Too many people just test, for example, just for the positive, not realizing, they missed something. Especially true when you get to regular expressions. You may think, oh, this all works, and then you test with a pattern that it should fail, and it still passes, then I got to tweak my pattern. All right. A couple other things here. I don't want to keep people too late. I am not a big fan of the return keyword. Now, I know there are places where we have to use it, but I also see people do code like this. So this function is just going to get a random number between 1 and 100. If the number is greater or equal to 50, it returns the value. And I'm going to keep looping basically until it returns the value or until the count equals 0. So I'm counting down. So if I load this here, I'll show you the problem with return. There may have been other numbers, other objects that this function would have written to the pipeline. When PowerShell sees the return keyword, up here, it returns that value and then terminates the pipeline. So don't do that. This is an easy trap to fall into, especially if you come from a programming or developer background where you're kind of learning the concept of returning a value. We used to kind of do this in VB script as well. We returned a value. PowerShell is not about returning values. At least in my way. I think you should be writing functions that write objects to the pipeline. The only time you'd want to use like a return a value is if you're writing a function like convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, where there's only going to be one result. So fine, I'm going to return that value. I'm okay with that. I will occasionally use return when I intentionally want to bail out of something and want to display a message. But that is more an exception rather than the rule. So let me show you my better version. This is still a little awkward. So this is looping through 10 times. My verbose output. All right, so that's a little bit better. See, because I'm not using the return keyword, I'm counting through all my 10 objects, and I got, in this case, this many objects that were greater or equal to 50. But really, just let the pipeline do its thing. So here, I'm just going to get 10, in this case, by default, 10 numbers between 1 and 100 where the number is greater or equal to 50. So instead of trying to do that awkward loop and then exiting out, don't do that. Just, I was trying to clean it up. Let the pipeline do its thing. That's a much better way to approach it. Again, I will intentionally use that here. So I'm not going to run this code, but I have in my try catch block, if this fails, then I'm going to write a warning that it failed to validate the path, abandoning the process, and then I just use the return keyword. Actually, I will run this here because I'll. All right, so that is without any errors. So everything worked as expected. So you can see I've got an end block there. So if I do the invoke with a bad path, all right, so there's my return, which then exits out of so as soon as I hit return, I did not get these lines. So there's my warning, and then the next place this jumps to is the end block. The return keyword is going to exit out of whatever scope you are in. So this catch block has its own scope. I'm sorry, the process block is really where this is exiting out of. So return exits out of the process block, and then PowerShell goes then onto the end block where I get my write verbose statement. So return has its place, but you have to be very intentional about where you intend to terminate the pipeline. And that's the way I think of return is I'm going to use this when I want to specifically terminate the pipeline. Otherwise, let's just let PowerShell do its thing. All right. Another thing that you can think about to make your code better, it's certainly easier to read, is to learn how to use a switch statement as opposed to long multiple if and else if statements. If you have an if else if that is more than 4 or 5 or much longer, you need to rewrite that as a switch because it will be easier to read and understand than using an if statement. For example, if I get my operating system, instead of having code to decode that if state or to decode the build number, so again, running Windows 11, all right, so maybe this isn't that bad, but it's tedious and it's kind of repetitive. The better approach would be to use a switch. So this is the same, going to give me the same logic and same result. And why did that not work? What is my OS build number? Windows 11 22631. Oh, that's why, because I've got a typo here. There we go. So the switch, this code is, I think, a little bit easier to read than this. There's a lot of extra stuff here with all these else if statements. One big difference is that in an if else if statement, PowerShell will stop running after the first comparison or evaluation that is true. So as soon as one of these else if statements is true, PowerShell jumps to the end. A switch statement allows me to potentially run multiple codes. Now, in this particular case, my build number is only going to match one of these values. But it maybe I'm going to do something where it's going to do something on multiple matches. So here's a little sample function. And the switch statement allows you to do string comparisons. You can do regex comparisons, wildcard. You can evaluate code. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to get a file, and then I'm running code. So if the length of the file is greater than 1,000, I'm going to run code in this script block. If the extension matches a PowerShell file, I'm going to run that code. And if it matches to be a JSON or CSV file, whatever, I'm going to write that code. If it doesn't match any of these, then the code in the default will run. So there is my 2 lines from the switch statement, and there's the XML file. So it's small enough. It's not a large file, but it's a data file. So having the switch actually gives me more flexibility than trying to do this with a set of if statements. And of course, you need to read Sean's excellent documentation on about _switch. I think not enough people use switch and they rely too much on complicated if statements.
Jeff?
Yeah.
Do you ever use the switch in that manner? The second one that you showed us, like in a catch block up the top of a function to catch the error statements before, error conditions before you do normal processing?
I have not. That's certainly a valid use case.
Okay, it's the first time I'd seen a valid use of that particular. Let's do multiple condition checks here or multiple value checks, and I go, I wonder if that could be a code block or code. What am I thinking of? Code error detection. Yeah, there's a specific term for it where you put your error condition checks up at the top, and then, if there's no errors, then you fall through and do normal processing. Check block.
Yeah, so switch is really powerful. If you read the documentation here, there's lots of ways that you can use it. It's a much cleaner way of taking action based upon some condition, and it can be sometimes easier to do it this way than to try to write complicated if statements. And the code, that you have here, it can be as long as the complicated you need to be. Mine's simple. I'm just doing a right host line, but it can be as long or as complicated as you want. All right. The last thing I kind of really want to make sure I talk about here is this idea of thinking locally but acting remotely. So let's look at, I have a function here that's going to create a custom object. It's called a quick system status that's going to display some information about a computer. Nothing too fancy here. So like many of you, you probably write code and you try it all out on your local computer and go, okay, that works and that's really nice. But maybe I want this code, I even gave an alias, to be able to run remotely. So I'm going to create a PS session to one of my test VMs here. Now this function is only on my local computer. It's not in a module. It's not in anything that I can install. Yeah, I could copy the file over, and that's not too much work. Instead of what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in this particular case, I'm going to copy the function script block, and I'm going to create a version of it in the function PS drive on my remote machine. There we go. All right, so I copy that file over. So now in my remoting session, I can use the invoke command and run that function. So I created it locally, but I'm running it, I copied it, and basically I'm running it remotely. And that can be that's kind of nice for one-off sorts of things, interactive work. But let's see if there's a better way to do this function. So here is, and again, these functions are not necessarily production ready. They're lacking everything that you would possibly want. So consider everything I'm showing you educational proof of concept. I'm taking basically the same code that I just had in that first version of the function. And that really is all inside the script block here. And I think I'm adding some additional information to the output. So I've defined my script block. So that is the code that is actually the meat of the function that's going to generate the object that I want. The function here, this get system status function, is basically a wrapper that is going to invoke that script block over remoting, even if that remoting is to myself. So the default computer name is a local computer name, and I've credential as a optional parameter. So in my begin script block, I'm defining a hash table to build for invoke command. The process block then updates the computer name parameter with whatever the parameter values are from the function. And then I have my try catch block. Now I'm I'm saving the output to $R and then kind of recreating the object in the function locally so that it isn't a deserialized object and I can get rid of the run space ID and all of that. So here's where I'm defining my quick system sets. Remember I said earlier or at the very beginning, think about where the code is running and where your output and all that. So in this case here, the function starts on my machine. It actually gets the data from the remote machine and then processes the output again locally. We're going to kind of follow that. So now if I load that function and run it locally, and of course, yes, there is a requirement that you have remoting enabled. So there you can see in my verbose output, I'm starting the command, and this is all the Win32 stuff because my function has code to pass the verbose preference to the script block in the remoting session. So there is my output. And actually, if I were to pipe that to, let's save that to a variable. So there's my quick system status. And then if I do this to my domain controller, and what did I? Oh, I did something wrong here. What did I? Oh, processes Mitch. I have a bug here. I thought I had this working. Param. Begin. Ah. I see. This is why I didn't do it here. Little thing that I do is I usually add a closing comment for a closing curly brace. So when I collapse stuff, then I can kind of see and make sure that I don't miss anything, which is what has happened here. Now if I format that, there we go. That looks better. Now let's dot source that. All right, that's much better. And let's do it with my domain controller. So this is then creating the remoting session and executing the script block. And then I create my output from the remote output on my machine. Of course, I didn't verify that okay. So let's see here. So I should, oh yeah, it does take value from pipeline. So I should be able to do so think locally, but write your code so that you can reuse it remotely and take advantage of remoting. That way I don't have to try to copy anything or install anything on a remote server. It can all run on my machine, and I can make my code a little more flexible. Now, I could even take this a step further, or if you wanted to, is you could add a parameter set to maybe use an existing PS session. And then that would make it even more flexible. Thinking again about where someone might be using your code and their expectations. Was there a question?
Yeah, Jeff, I just want to, I don't know how many people I'm speaking for on this call, but for me, that piece sums up like the last 5 years of writing code and having to adjust it for remote, and just what an epiphany. So glad you brought that up. This is a game changer. Thank you.
All right.
And Jeff, before you roll on, what was the format that time was being output as?
The time.
Because it was 7.10 something for the time in the code.
Yeah, 7 days.
For the
Okay. And where is that in the code? I missed that part.
So my uptime.
Try.
Now the uptime is coming from the script block, and it's defining that. Where? Oh, here's the uptime. So I'm creating a hash table. I'm adding uptime. I'm just doing a time span of the today's date from the last boot up time from the OS class.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so the script block that's running either locally or remotely is this, $hash script block. That is the output of the script block. I'm actually not writing a real object, but I can reference the properties or the keys in the hash table as properties, and that's what I'm doing down here to actually create the actual output of the function that has the type name by using and referencing the keys from the pipeline or from the script block. I'm just going to jump down here to some final code writing tips here. Hopefully it goes without saying you should follow the community accepted best practices. We all know what that is about comments and white spaces and use of aliases and all of that. That should be a given. That should be first thing that you think about when you're writing code. I also recommend that you write your code vertically. Take advantage of splatting. The worst thing, or maybe it's not the worst thing. One thing that I hate and I try to avoid is writing code that scrolls. And even though I've got a 42-inch monitor, I didn't always have that. And so I always hated having to scroll over. If I've got to take my hands off the keyboard and reach over to scroll over to read the code, that just slows me down. Write your code vertically so that it's easy to read. And you'll see that in a lot of my examples here where I've written my everything kind of vertical. I try to avoid having code or anything in here where I have to scroll all the way over to read it. Avoid redundant code. I try, and this is where things like switches can help you, and thinking about how your code is going to flow. Avoid having code where you're basically copying and pasting the same command, but maybe just tweaking a parameter. So you're running get child item, but with like 4 different parameter sets in your code. Learn how to use splatting or PS bound parameters so that you only have to write the code once, and then you just modify the parameter values that are going to go to that command. Even better, learn to, what I'm trying to write here, componentize it. This is especially true if you have code that's just invoking a .NET method. Write a very simple helper function that passes data to that .NET method. This is especially important because you want to pester test your code, and you can't write a pester test for a .NET method. You can only pester test functions and commandlets. So write your code and separate out the little tiny bits and pieces that are reusable and put them into little helper functions. If it's a function that is not intended to be viewed by the user, don't use a standard name. I never do. That way, if I have a set of helper functions and I do get command for my module and I see a function name that has an underscore in it, I know I screwed something up, because that function name with an underscore in it is my clue that that is a private function that is used internally in my code. feel free to create as many of those little helper tools as you can. Don't try to copy and paste stuff over and over again. Find ways to make it reusable. Try to use consistent casing, and this includes things like camel casing and whatnot. I am going through the process. I used to be really sloppy about this, and so like here I have a parameter that is as int, but I may later have written it that way, and it's kind of, it doesn't affect the code. It just makes it sometimes a little bit harder to read. So I've started getting in the habit of going through. I have a spell checker, and so it'll pick up if stuff like in camel case, so I got C spell, so it doesn't recognize that, but it will recognize it. And I'll also take advantage of the change all occurrences here. So if I screw it up, I just do that. Now, any place that was using that string, it's now all the proper case. It just makes your code easier to read, and it makes it, I think, a little more professional. So watch your casing, and that also goes for stuff, spacing as well. Yeah, that will work. You can see I took away the spaces there, but the code is easier to read if you put the spaces on either side of the equal sign. In the PowerShell ISE, it used to be that if you didn't have those spaces, it kind of could throw the AST off. Though maybe that might have been really early versions of PowerShell. But think about how your code looks and how it reads. It should read like a story. That's why when you have comment-based help, it should go here in a standalone function. Note here, comment-based help goes here. Don't put it at the end. Put it where someone looking at your code and trying to understand what your code is doing, because that could be you in 6 months, can read and see, oh, this is what the code does. This is how the parameters work. Here's some examples. And if you do it for a standalone function, when you take that function and put it in a module and use the platypus commands, it will consume that help, that comment-based help, and create your markdown documents, and you're on your way to having really good help. So it's not a waste of time to do comment to do comment-based help here. In fact, even for your parameters, even though the user is probably never going to see this help message, if I put this here, knowing that eventually this might be in a module and I generate help with platypus, it'll pick this up and it'll give that help as the, it'll put that in the help content. So do that. Standardize on code layout standards, especially if you are in a team. Decide if you want that standard or that standard. God, I don't really care. Although it should be up here. It should look like that. That is wrong. Just so you know. I'm waiting and waiting. No.
How dare you?
So
Ooh.
come up with your standard about how you want your code to look. Think about standards for casing, variable names. Certainly your variable names should be meaningful. SB is probably not the best name here. In fact, maybe I'll change this. Here, let's try this. Let's change this to I don't know, maybe that's a little bit better. So by using that change occurrences, that now changed it everywhere in my code.
And at that point, using fee is not beneficial, but, hey, characters are free at that point, in the code themselves. It doesn't harm you in any form.
Right.
So be as verbose as possible in code, because it's only for you in 3 months.
Yeah, so if I define a variable $X, and then 100 lines later I see I'm doing something with $X, and go, oh, wait a minute, what is $X? Or if it's a $computer name, go, oh, $computer, it's computer name, it's the name of a computer. So now for me, I'm the only one really looking at my code, and I kind of have a habit that if I use SB, I know that means script block. But I need to start thinking maybe I should probably do a little bit better. Although I do have comments here that says this defines a script block that will run remotely or locally. That will run via invoke command. That's probably a little cleaner.
I think to your point is also the fact that you said is that, hey, you defined it up here, you put your comment here, but then you're going to use it, 75 lines down. And so which value is this? And especially if you're using that variable multiple times and redefining it 3 times in that span of 40 lines of code, it is beneficial to re-effective, keep your verbs or your actually not verbs, but your variables themselves as verbose as possible, because characters don't really matter at that point. So
yeah, so like this hash table, again, here, see my vertical code, this hash table, it doesn't get used till much later in the function, even though I'm defining it up in the begin block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's the best practice at that point.
And we talked about writing rich objects to the pipeline with custom formatting. Use the keyword return intentionally. Don't assume you know how your code will be used. You may have no idea how you want to use your function tomorrow. So write it as flexible as possible. Learn how to use parameter validation. Learn the proper way to use try-catch. Don't force the user to jump through hoops. Do your job as a script writer and a tool maker. I can probably think of a few Microsoft commands, and I've seen some other code from the community. I definitely won't mention names, where they're making it harder to use because they didn't take the time to do the things that would make it easier for the user, such as adding, for example, even something as simple as taking pipeline input. Because maybe the way that the function works, the way someone's going to think to work it, yeah, I'm going to take a command and pipe it to this command. But the author of the function didn't take the time to code for that, and so I'm forced to get my data, pipe to for each object, and then run the command. That is just tedious. You want to write your code so that the person can use it in the PowerShell ecosystem, because you have no idea what commands they might run to feed into your command or what they're going to do with the output of your command. So you have to be able to consume objects and write rich objects to the pipeline that the user can then use however they want. Again, unless you like getting phone calls from people saying, hey, I can't use this. So that was really all I wanted to say. Same thing here with talking about modules. Other questions that people might have, or anything else that you want to see or have me show you again?
So I'll give our in-person attendees a chance to ask a question, and then we have some stuff I can ask.
I mean, others I can stop sharing and we can just go back and chatting. But is there anything else people want to see or a question over something that I showed you? And again, I'll get this all shared out for everyone so you'll have access to all of this.
Well, I think what we should do is wrap this up here. And then, so for the people who watch at home, understand that this is a user group, and so when we end the recording, the meeting doesn't necessarily end. We usually expand on the topics that the speakers talk about. So, Jeff, first of all, the line of the night for me was, I don't care which way you do your brackets, but this way's wrong. I love that. I don't really care what you choose, but this one's wrong.
Yeah.
I thought you covered a lot of great topics tonight, a lot of concepts. What I wanted to do to help out the people watching that are trying to piece some of these things together is whether they're your own or others that you're aware of, what are some resources or books that you've written or others have written that they can use to sort of expand the knowledge of the things that we kind of touched upon quickly tonight?
Well, there really aren't, because a lot of what I talked about, again, are these little squishy, non-technical bits. It's not syntax. Knowing that your code is easier to read if you use splatting and make it vertical, that it just either comes through experience or someone showing you and explaining why you should do it. That it's not a.
Is there not really like a best practices? Is there not on like 101, the PowerShell 101, and but it's given mechanics. I think to your point is mechanics that's typically mechanics and not versus best practices or ease of use, right?
Well, I understand Jeff's point that maybe it's not a book you can read about the things he talked about, but I would counter and say that there's a lot of things that Jeff talked about that require some experience, like comfort levels with switch statements, right? And try catches were in there tonight and some other things. And so I think those really come down to tool making books, right? Teach you how to write your code as tools and develop the things that you would need to produce a tool. So maybe we'll stop there. So for those who aren't aware, that Jeff is one of the original co-authors of the PowerShell in a Month of Lunches series, and there was 2 other books that came after that in that series, tool making, and I forgot the last one of the 3.
Tool making, yeah.
Tool making.
Yeah, we're not on Leanbug. See, I've been writing. This makes my head hard to think about it, but I've been writing and using PowerShell since like 2005. Some people who probably in the meeting were probably still in middle school when Sydney and Steven, the PMs on the Microsoft team, I've had this talk with them. Yeah, they were in middle school when I started doing PowerShell.
Yeah.
So to me, the language is completely second nature. I dream in. I don't think about what I want to do, but that's why I now have kind of shifted some of my focus to, because there are lots of people who can show people the mechanics of how to do parameter validation, for example. But understanding why you should put that in and where and when you should put that in, that's a more soft, I guess it is kind of a soft skill topic, or again, I'm calling it squishy because it's not a hard and fast technical, Sean can document, this syntax or this set of parameters. It's more, and for all I know, everything I've shown you is just my personal opinion. And people are certainly welcome to say, yeah, he's full of it, and yeah, never mind, I'm going to do it my way. And go right ahead. I've just been basing a lot of stuff that I write about and stuff I talked about tonight based on all the years that I have spent doing PowerShell, plus all the students I've had in classes and at conferences and user groups, and seeing people's code and understanding how they're working, stuff that I have seen people do and struggle with. Everything that I'm kind of doing now and stuff I'm talking about with these soft parts to PowerShell, that's where that all comes from. So,
Well,
I'm not just like making it up and wondering, by what vodka infused haze, can I come up with tonight? It's all based on stuff that I've seen in the real world.
it may be your personal preferences, and that's fine. But the point to take away is that Jeff has a lot of road miles and experience understanding these concepts, fleshing them out, and your personal preferences are grounded in strong fundamentals and principles. So if they're going to follow a set of personal preferences, this is certainly not a bad set of personal preferences to sort of start with and develop their own if they don't agree. But Phil, we're going to wrap this up. Before I get to Phil, I had a question for Jeff. So you were talking about the squishy bits, and maybe this doesn't fit into the books. The stuff that you talked about tonight, is that a fairly good example of some of the things you've been writing about in the newsletter that you're publishing?
Yeah, it is. Actually, tonight's talk I drew from a couple recent articles. So a lot of the things I do in the newsletter were kind of based on this idea of what's the stuff that people need to know that really isn't documented or there aren't books about. And you don't think about these things until you have someone say, hey, I can't get this code to work, or it doesn't work, like the code that had the extra blank output lines. Yeah. I would never think to do that, but someone did. That's because that met their particular need. But then I had to explain the problems with that and why that's the wrong approach.
So I think that's the value in which, the experience which Jeff brings is this tribal knowledge of, hey, of all of the things that people have seen externally or even found code online. And that's been my experience with so much is people, hey, I found this other example online and I'm trying to transition that piece of code or this flow into PowerShell and going, that just doesn't work the same way. Or it's not the best practice because the pipeline operates differently than Python or VB. So don't write a batch script in PowerShell. Like, write PowerShell. And it's a tough thing to, and I like the fact that he brought in the squishy bits, because the idea is that's the real value, but it's hard to explain the squishy bits with it. So I think you did a great job there, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, you can have ChatGPT write you a function, and maybe mechanically it will all work and do the job, but is it really the best that code could be?
Yeah. So, well, can it do more than can it use the full spectrum of what PowerShell can do? Did it write it in a way that it is modularized and it can then just transpose and just easily be consumed by the next commandlet down the road? And his point with formatting is that, can it just be then piped out to something else? Or no, you now need to transpose it into something else. Or in the reverse is, can you then to do parameter validation to it? Can it just take anything you want and then just have at it? But if you write it in those ways, the things that are not conducive. And so you did an awesome job, Jeff. And I really think you nailed some of those things. And, I think some people who are fairly new to the environment or to PowerShell can just absorb a lot of the content you provided and just almost like let it wash over them and going, okay, I need to watch this multiple times so that I can understand all the things that later on I can feel more squishy.
Yeah, and that's a good way. I always tell people, especially like when I'm presenting at conferences, because I tend to do a fire hose approach, say just let it wash over you. As long as you go back and use it and start working with it, eventually your mind will start making the connections, and then you'll have that aha moment. Go, oh, now I see. That's what Jeff was talking about, and it'll make sense.
Yeah, and I think to even know, and to your point there, Jeff, is you kind of showed the proper way to do some stuff, and then not the proper way to not do it, but is to focus on the ways to properly do it, so that when you go and you're in this world of, hey, I know that there's a way that I can do this, is to find the right way. So like with the GPTs and stuff like that, is it not so much as like, can I search for it, but do I know how to properly search for the parts? Like, I know that there's a way that I can pipe this in a way that I can do this, right? I want to do it in this form, but I need to find the right part of code and to do it that way. And so it's the searching the right piece in. So it's a good job.
Well,
Thanks.
Well, Jeff, I just want to tell you that I got the ultimate compliment. My coworker made it to the end of the presentation. He's not usually a late night guy, so you must have did a great job.
Great to see you, Matt.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Mike. Hey, Jeff, I love it. Thank you. Y'all have a good one.
So we're going to wrap it up here. I want to say thank you very much to Jeff, as always, for doing another fantastic presentation for us. Longtime friend of the user group, and if you haven't had the pleasure of seeing some of the things that Jeff has talked about, Jeff has probably done 7 or 8 demos for us over the years. It's in our back catalog in the YouTube channel, so you can take a look at some of the other topics he's covered. If you'd like to join us in person, check us out at rtpsug.com, or as I said earlier in Meetup, you can look for RTPsug or Research Triangle PowerShell group. And the benefit of joining us in person is you get to ask the questions of the presenters instead of watching and wondering what they were talking about. So once again, we're going to say thanks to Jeff, and we're going to thank to everybody who joined us tonight. We'll see you at the next one. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.